Is it working? 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 Okay, it's working. Alright, so I've been wanting to try and get this review in for a while now. It's just, Granny has been getting worse and worse in the mornings. And it's just like, I'm only now finished eating because I have to take care of her so much now in the mornings. So hopefully more of these will be able to be done once home health care comes in and starts taking care of her in the mornings, which is currently rapidly becoming the worst period of time to deal with her. I'm thoroughly and completely exhausted by just having to deal with her. But on top of that, I also really reconsidered a lot for this next one. I wanted to continue with the characters. There's other topics I also want to talk about, but I really wanted to continue with the characters and get a general character overview done. And as I was digging into the Kiheitai, Takasugi's group, to try and decide how I wanted to break this down, there's a surprisingly large amount of content for all three of them to be talked about. And I wanted to start with the pervert man, for multiple reasons. The first fact of the matter is that his name is Takechi, which actually comes up quite a number of times in the story. I don't think it's the same characters as mentioned by the others, but the main reason I wanted to talk about him is that he kind of hits on something that that kind of differentiates a good story from a bad story. Because when a story introduces a character that feels out of place, whose moralities are easier to question, and presents them in a light kind of like what they've done with Takechi, with our pedo bastard, you have to immediately question why. Why is the story treating this character like he's a human at all? He's a pedophile. And so you want to dig in. You want to dig into that question. You want to, because this is a blemish. This is outwardly a blemish on the show. And generally speaking, you want to dig in and try and figure out what choices have been made to put this character in, to have this character be a part of the story. And the reasons behind that are kind of the difference between a good show like Gintama and a bad show like, say, Bleach. Because when you look at, let's start with the Bleach thing, you dig one step into, because Bleach does have their own pedophile, rapist, bastard character that's introduced very late in that extra story bit that happens after Aizen's destroyed. He's introduced as a villain, and he's beaten, and then he redeems himself. And when you start to dig into that character, the only answers as to why he exists is they needed a villain. They needed a way to show that the main villain's worse than this villain. And redemption is a fun thing to do sometimes, even though they don't actually do a redemption for him. They just say, he's swapped sides and now he's fine because he's on the right side now. His morality's still fucked, but who cares? That is incredibly shallow writing. That is, I need a character as a tool to pad time and to try and farcically enhance the main villain. Literally, he's just a tool. But in Gintama, you've got a pedophilic character on the villain's team. And what is he there for? Well, first off, he's telling us a lot about who Takasugi is, what Takasugi values. Takasugi values capability and intent over morals. He doesn't really care who he teams up with. He cares that he accomplishes his goals. He's willing to make moral sacrifices in order to pursue his objectives, which sounds similar to the whole thing with Bleach, where you're having this character modify the villain. But in Bleach, none of these associations are made. He's a hire by the villain, but, like, they don't talk. We don't see scenes with them together. We don't see how the villain interacts with him. And there is nothing about his morality that implies anything about the villain's morality. Here, all of this is made fairly explicit and straightforward. On top of that, there's further layers underneath this surface appearance of this character. He's physically a weakling. He's not difficult to actually deal with in a fight. He's literally there for his brain power. And on top of that, he actually sacrifices. He's actually willing to do the right thing because his morality isn't necessarily tied entirely to pedophilia. That is a sexual preference. And this ties into greater themes of the story of how you can be individually wrong on some points but still be a good person in general. Plus, he's based on an actual historical person who at the time married a very young girl in the time period that he was alive when it was legal. And this is the thing that you can kind of do with Gintama that is difficult to wrap your head around. This man is a tactical genius, and yes, he's a pedophile. But this is a merger of historic and modernism that's happening with this show. This man, historically, was a very well-renowned tactician. He did a lot for the shogunate. He held a position of high power and large respect. Because modernity has been shoved into the 1400s, his sexual preferences have become illegal. Have become very viciously illegal and very morally wrong. And so he who wants power and wants that tactical position back is looking for a way to worm his way back into power. He had not expected any of this to come for him. This world has turned against him. And it's an interesting perspective, because on the first hand, like, yes, pedophilia is wrong. But on the other hand, even recent history, I'll give an example, and people aren't going to like me when I say this, but there are even presidents in American history that took very young wives because that was the way things were. Like, the entire concept of age range is of like protecting children from being married before a certain age is a fairly new concept. And you can tell because the age range that they're protected to varies from country to country. I'm not saying this in any like moral, we shouldn't be I think the moral choice is to be protecting the children. But like, we need to kind of understand how young this concept is and how far we still have to go. And on top of that, the other thing being discussed here is what are the penalties and what are the limits that we can actually ascribe here, because what we're being shown is a character who has a fetish that puts him on a morally wrong and destructive path. But he can't actually affect that fetish. Like, he doesn't have a choice. His body has been born for this to be his thing. He likes this concept. And the question is, well, okay, he acts on it. That's fair enough. He acts on it, but what's the penalty for acting on something that his body has determined it wants to do, even if it's morally wrong? What's the penalty? What damages need to be done? Is it the death penalty? Or is there some middle ground in which we can prevent him from doing the harmful things while allowing what is clearly a otherwise okay-ish person, like he's an asshole, but, like most characters in Gintama are assholes. That's kind of a universal... Like, if we take aside the pedophilia, his character is relatively as asshole-ish as any of the other characters. But he isn't, more or less decent than the rest of them, really. He's about as morally gray as any of the other characters end up being. What is there a way to make a middle ground where this person who would otherwise be doing something he shouldn't be doing could be allowed to live a life freely without penalty and punishment while being set aside from the things that he shouldn't be doing? Or is there a way to cure that part of him? There's something to be said for differences, but there's something to be said for being born with desires that are morally wrong. This is a similar discussion that can be made with sociopaths. Do sociopaths deserve to be tried to... Should we try to solve the part where they're lacking empathy, and see if we can return them to humanity? Or is it fair to just put them in a prison, in a cell somewhere, or kill them? Is that fair? They didn't make that choice. It's not something that they chose to do. It's an interesting concept, and we see, and this kind of jumps onto the same train as I was talking about with Sanji in One Piece. What penalties, what is the dividing lines of morality? If you are a pedophile, does that just mean you are an evil person, period, end of story, and you need to either be locked away forever or killed? Is that just the line? You've crossed the line, and now, as a human being, your life is forfeit. Even though this isn't something you chose, this is something your body chose for you, and to you it's not morally wrong. The whole world seems to disagree. Or is there a way to prevent you from to either fix that body problem, much like when you have someone with gender dysphoria or something, where their body is wrong, and you can fix the body? Can we do the same here and figure out a way to fix this desire, this part that can only really hurt both parties involved, both the person who has it and the people who they push that desire onto? Is there a way to fix that? Or do we make some allowances, drawn images, animated shows and whatnot, to fulfill this desire and keep them generally away from anybody that they could physically harm in an actual and real way, rather than using the tools of imagination that are at our disposal to sate the desire and allow the person to rejoin society? And further, this brings into question and call a greater discussion on who is and isn't at fault here. Because 95% of pedophilic assault, most of the time it's over power. The person who abused the child maybe doesn't even care for children as specifically. It's power. It's the fact that they can have complete power over the child. And these people generally are also always found in positions of high power because they fetishize and enjoy power specifically. And so the people that actually have pedophilic fetishes, and trust me, I'm going to say this, and I do online role-playing with sexual partners, online role-playing. I don't play with underage players. I just don't personally like the concept of underage play. But the number of times it comes up, the sheer number of these people who are seeking something that they can't have is insane. There is a lot of people who find the interplay between an older and younger person to be interesting and engaging on a sexual level. It's not uncommon. It's probably one of the biggest fetishes I run across, barring maybe BDSM. Like, it may be the second category underneath BDSM in terms of number of people who have this specific kink. And what do you do with that? What do you do with that information? Are all of these people, destined for the prison or to have their heads separated from their bodies? It's very common. It's a very common fetish. But I don't think all of those people are acting on it. I think most people are looking for a way to express that fetish without actually touching a child. I think most people can see that the act of actual pedophilia is bad, that it hurts the child, that the child is not able to consent, and therefore shouldn't be harmed. Which means that having that fetish, having that desire, maybe that isn't something that needs to be as criminalized. If there's, and there are limits. There are things that need to be set down. Things like images taken of real children in sexual situations. That's not legal. That shouldn't be legal. That's not morally good. That it means that a child was hurt. Passing those images around only propagates the need for more of those images. So locking that down helps. However, a drawn image or an animated skit, no child was hurt during those actions. That was just an artist drawing a rendition of something. I can't find that morally wrong. Role-playing as a younger person, either in real life or or on online spaces. I mean, baby fetish play is a thing, which, speaking of Gintama, you're not even a stone's throw now away from Ayumi, the guy that stalks Kyubey all the time and definitely has a baby fetish. We see that in the Gal Game arc where he comes in with his Kyubey version of Pinko who then babies him, and he asks for diaper changes. Like, this is 100% a thing that people do. It's weird to some of us. I certainly don't find it engaging on a sexual level. I find it strange and interesting on a psychological level. Because, moving even further, generally speaking, fetish and kink stem from unresolved psychological issues. It's not even really trauma, it's issues. It's something that the brain couldn't figure out how to emotionally deal with. Like, it couldn't be sad about it, it couldn't be angry about it, it couldn't be happy about it. So it has all these categories of emotions to assign things to, and if it can't assign things to an emotion, it puts it in the horny pile. It's like, all right, well, catch all, it's sexual now. I don't know what to do with this. So some of these might also just require simple therapy to figure out what the unresolved situation is and resolve it so that it gets an emotional expression and the body can recategorize it and move it out of the sexual bin. Because, like, any time, and I'm not even kidding here, literally, the reason sexual fetish is such a huge topic and such a huge group of categories is because anything that we cannot emotionally categorize somewhere else, we put it in the horny bin. We don't know what to do with it, so we'll fap to it. Human beings are messed up. I'm not kidding. This is how things happen. This is how kinks and fetishes are built, and they don't really come from. Some of it comes from genetic. There is a genetic portion of it, and there's a portion that is psychological. But even then, my initial point that it's not something that they chose still stands. These things are formed during childhood. These behaviors are formed during childhood. So it would be something that would have formed when he was a child, and and on top of that, it's hard to even. And now we move on to the other side of this issue, which is like, by categorizing, and I believe in Japan the age of consent is 14, which is kind of highlighting the issue here. Female puberty generally ends around 12. By 12, girls look more or less adult. Young adult. And there is a gap in terms of predation between men going after girls between 12 and 18, and that is some range of legal and not legal there, versus men going after pretty much girls under 12 that are not fully developed. The under 12 crowd is much, much, much smaller. The people that go after really young children is astronomically smaller than the ones that will happily go after a teenager. Because, especially with women, by the time they're teenagers, their bodies have pretty much finished puberty. Like, there's still some changes to come, but the bulk of the puberty is now done. And this is where it gets really, really tough, because morally, I would say 18 is still the smart thing to do. Because while the physical changes are done, the mental changes, the emotional changes are not. In fact, the brain stops forming for humans at 21. So if we really wanted to get to that, to get to a fully moral area, 21 might be smarter. But even then, by 18, and then you add on to that the hormonal shit. So kids start fucking early. And I mean that without commas. Fucking early. Hormones be like that. I mean, I was a little bit late myself, but like, that was 12 for me. I started and I haven't stopped since. Being sexually active is an important part of growing up. And horny children, horny teenagers, more specifically, are difficult to deal with on a lot of levels. And some of that spreads into them developing their own fetishes, their own kinks, their own understanding of relationship between people on a sexual level, their sexuality, their individuality, like all of that is part of their journey. And some part of that is going to be reaching out to older people and asking for advice or even exploration. And I do think that up until 18, the moral thing is for the adult to set very strict limits. They can give advice. They can give verbal advice. I think verbal advice is incredibly important in this situation. But at the same time, it's their job when physical exploration is being requested. It's the adult's job before the teenager is 18 to be very strict and say no. You need to grow a bit more before you start experimenting with people that much older than you. I kind of personally like 18, and I know that's partially because that's what I was raised with. But 18 to 21, which is those final years of formation for the brain, you've been given enough freedom to kind of explore yourself now, and you still have time to kind of form and manipulate your body a little bit. You've still got room to grow as a person. I think that's a fine little gap to have there. And I know like this quickly turned into a conversation about sexuality and sex, but that is kind of at the core of what this character is hinting at, is alluding to, is to this idea that there is more. And it fits in because there's so much other fetish stuff in Gintama. Like, there's an entire gender bender arc. The BDSM comes up constantly in the show. Fucking Ayumi is a baby boy. Fetish is woven into this story, and in that way, Takechi is another reflection of those same fetishes, and that he starts out on the villain's side and is eventually steadily kind of redeemed. And even on the villain's side, he's treated as the joke. He's treated as the comedic relief, which is filling in the slot of comedic relief for Takasugi's group, which is desperately needed for such a serious group, as well as giving Mikoto something to play off of. Otherwise, Mikoto would have been a completely uninteresting character. Just because, she wouldn't have anything to interact with. Because Bankai is a very distant person and has his own intricacies going on. Banzai. And then Takechi, that leaves Takechi being the comedy for Takasugi's group, and every team has to have some comedy in there. It's a comedy show, first off, and second off, Gintama just wouldn't be Gintama without comedy. So, and yet, he triggers this intricate and more detailed discussion because he falls in with the themes. And this is, again, like, this is the difference between a well-written story and a poorly written story. He fits in with the themes that are going on. He provides a direct reflection to some of those themes, and we get some form of reconciliation and understanding that, like, as much as... Because, like, and one of the things that is fantastic about Gintama is that aside from the innocent people that are kind of shoved into this pedophilic role because of their fetishes, he has actually done the terrible thing. He married very, very young. He married a much younger woman, in like the character that he's based off of, and he, and he like, he's done the terrible deed. He's crossed that moral threshold. He's not an innocent observer. And yet, aside from that, he's a decent person. He's a tactical genius. He has a lot to offer. And he's willing to put himself his body on the line for his allies when need be. He's willing to stand there and take a fight. Even though he's not a fighter. He's willing to put his body on the line to do it. And he's willing to stand up, not for his beliefs. He's willing to push his beliefs and try and manipulate the situation to make his life better. But he's willing to put his life on the line for the people he considers his allies and friends. And that is a respectable thing to do, even if you have some aspect that is morally reprehensible. It is difficult to grasp this sort of concept of the multiplicity that is that can be a single person, that can be someone like this character, who then that sort of moral line that he's a pedophilic bastard, and that is a moral line that he has crossed, and he can't cross back over. And more interestingly than that, it feels like a deeper moral line, a darker moral line to cross than simply being a murderer, which is Takasugi's, the line that Takasugi crossed a long time ago. And in fact, the line that Gintoki himself crossed a long time ago. And that itself is a bit of a reflection on the perversion of morals that has happened in society, where him being a pedophile is a far more serious offense than Gintoki's murder, than Gintoki's multiple murders, Katsuda's multiple murders, Takasugi's multiple murders. That pedophilia is considered by society's standards to be far less excusable and far less reversible, which is just a weird reflection of how the world is, and there's an argument to be made there. You know, the victim of a pedophile is still alive and still has to suffer the long-term effects of the assault. There is an argument to be made that not only do we have similar damages overall as a murder might create, but, and yes, I know that, like, I'm lumping Gintoki and Katsuda in with Takasugi in terms of the murder thing, but, like, most of that occurred during a war, which we already kind of excuse already. But they've both had killings since. Especially by the end of the story. Gintoki's the most innocent here. He certainly goes out of his way to not kill, but he's had multiple skirmishes where he has definitely killed people. And it wasn't under a wartime situation. It was in pretty much all of these cases, self-defense, until you get to the last one, where it wasn't even really. It's a weird gray area with him killing Utsuro and Takasugi at the same time, because that's how that fight worked out. It's a gray area. It's not explicitly clear. Heck, Utsuru's own morality isn't necessarily clear. You know, he's been killed so many times. Yes, he's a monster, but, you know, it's hard to blame him. He's been hunted down and murdered so often. Morality forms at the core of Gintama beautifully, because everyone's got their own moral codes going on, and those codes are smashing against each other constantly. And this character, Takechi, who feels like such an outlier, who feels like the clearly morally bad character, a mistake to include in the cast, someone to be reviled and hated and despised on a consistent basis, is, when you dig in a little bit to his character, it's pretty clear that not only does he actually belong in the story, but his existence itself is making an argument that colors the rest of the story. And this is something that Gintama does very, very well, by positioning characters so that each character, when looked through in that character's lens, colors the story, affects how the story is viewed, affects the type of story you're reading, gives you a different perspective to look at. And this is why I'm trying to do character analysis reviews for Gintama, because the whole series is like this. You can recolor every single reading of this story by just looking through the lens of a different character. And this one really highlights the sexuality, the questions of morality, and what morality is justified, and how morality is justified, and what it means to be moral, what kind of choices you have to make, what kind of decisions have to be dealt with, the struggles that come from those decisions, how making callous and black and white choices can not just affect individuals, but have large rippling effects. Even just declaring an age for when children become adults, just picking a number, any number, has large, long-standing, rippling effects. Because 18 is the legal age in some countries, but even in the States, that's not entirely true. There's some states where it's 14. So if you cross state lines with a 14-year-old wife, you're now a criminal. And it's just like, it's that little bit of like a ripple effect of like, well, you have to understand that these choices are not easy to make. And I'm not sitting here trying to because I already actually dictated where my morals are on this, where I think the lines make the most sense to be drawn. And even then, I'm willing to say that there's a gray area around those lines. It's kind of important that there is a gray area around those lines, because again, we now have there's an entirely separate scenario here, and some countries have like 3-year laws where if you are within 3 years of the underage person, you're still fine. Because that gets around the next big problem, which is if your legal age is, say, 18, and you have a 17-year-old and an 18-year-old that are dating, and then a year passes, and now one of them's 18 and one of them's 19. Well, these people have been together dating for a year now. And now suddenly they're illegal because one person has crossed over that line and the other person has not yet. And there's only a 1-year age gap. Like, exceptions have to be baked in then. You have to have exceptions, and if you have to have exceptions, you have to start understanding that readings of laws need to be dealt with on a more individual basis than they're currently being dealt with, generally speaking. You have to be willing to give the benefit of the doubt, and also to be willing to, more viciously punish when it's very clear, when the moral lines are very clear. And this is something that Gintama goes into in quite a lot of depth. There's a lot of stories, and Gin himself fashions this. He, at the start of any story, he always waits. He doesn't rush into into any conflict. He gets a job, and unless the job is straightforward, like carpentry, and it's just, hey, go repair a roof. He's like, all right. I don't want to, but I'll do it. It's something to do with my hands, I guess. There's no moral question. Roofs have to be repaired. Homes have to be built. The moral questions are non-existent. But when it's, find my cheating husband, or find this killer, or, any of these stories where there's a person that's being the target of the job, he always goes slow. He always steps back and looks and tries to figure out what the other person's perspective is first. He wants the full story of what's happening before anything else, so that he can, in some cases, rush in and stop something that's truly bad from happening, or go back and reverse the request and figure out and either expose or even keep hidden the thing that's been hidden, or in some way try and just resolve the conflict in which both parties can be safe if nothing wrong is happening. He's not quick to judgment. He's not quick to take one side of the argument and go, all right, I'm just going to go for it. He waits until he can hear both sides, until he can see, and if there's questions, he looks for proof. He looks for evidence. He looks for the information, for actual physical information on the topic at hand before he makes any kind of judgment. And he makes slow, rational decisions about all of these things. He's very good at that. And he solves each one case by case. That is the approach that judicial systems really should be using, is a very careful, contemplative, understand what both sides of this argument are, and come to a conclusion that suits society as a whole, rather than what the law says or what the individual needs. Make sure that as many members involved can come out the other side happy as possible. And so it's not always going to be the case where everyone can come out happy, but it happens more often than the current judicial system thinks it does. And I ended up having to break the Henpeita into 3 videos because I'll have to do the other 2 on their own, because each of these characters are so well crafted and fleshed out, even when they don't have a lot of time on screen. The Henpeita do not have a huge amount of time on camera, but what time they have is capitalized on, and every moment is used to enhance these characters, to push them into being fleshed out characters, into being filled out people. This comes from, Takechi going from being this cowardish, guy who's standing in a fight shivering against Shinpachi of all people, to, running into a melee brawl, asking for signatures on his petition. Because, of course, a tactical genius who has been removed from his position of power would become an activist. Because that's the only way back into a position of power, is to actively change the law into something that would benefit him. Of course, And he even has that dress up as Takasugi to kind of improve his charisma. And he has all these funny moments, and he's just he's a fleshed out character who exists in the series. And, I understand people hating him. I don't like him very much. But I respect that he exists, and he fills the role that he was put in the show for very well. He does a very good job at what he's supposed to be doing in this story, which is pretty much true for every character in the series. That they fulfill the role that they were set up for. 45 minutes is, I think, enough for me. My throat is giving out. I'm very, very tired. I probably will not be streaming tonight. I've got just too much to do. I have to get going. I have to check on Granny. I have to move things around. I'll see you guys hopefully tomorrow. Later.